Her smile still glimmers through the grainy black and white footage of American Bandstand, a reminder of a time when youth itself seemed eternal. Viewers of the late 1950s knew her as Carmen MonteCarlo, but her real name was Carmella MonteCarlo, a detail worth remembering not only to honor her truth, but also to distinguish her from another dancer of that era, Carmen Jimenez. For a few shining years, Carmella embodied the rhythm of Philadelphia's teenagers, twirling across the studio floor with a grace that was never forced, only natural. She did not chase fame, it found her. And yet, her life, filled with promise, was heartbreakingly short. In 1985, at only 43, Carmella's story ended far too soon. What remains is not the silence of her absence, but the warmth of her presence, captured forever in those broadcasts, etched in the memory of a generation. This is her story, a story of dance, of family, of joy, and of loss. And perhaps, as we remember her, we also remember a part of ourselves. When American Bandstand went national in 1957, it instantly transformed ordinary teenagers into familiar faces across America. Among those early regulars was Carmella MonteCarlo, just a girl in her mid-teens who came not with dreams of stardom, but with the simple desire to dance. What set her apart was not ambition, but a quiet authenticity, the kind of presence that made her feel less like a performer and more like a friend who happened to be on the other side of the screen. Alongside her frequent partner, Charlie Zamal, Carmella became one of the program's most recognizable presences. Together, they formed a picture of youth that felt unscripted and genuine. Their steps weren't polished by professional training, but by afternoons spent moving naturally to the records that spun on the studio turntables. When the camera swept across the floor, it often found Carmella, her dark hair, her smile that flickered between shyness and delight, her movements alive with the energy of the music. What made her stand out was the consistency of her presence. 5 days a week, as viewers tuned in after school, she was there, dancing as though the music belonged to her. For teenagers watching at home, she became both an emblem of their own generation and a reminder that someone just like them could be part of something broadcast to the entire nation. In those days, when television still carried an air of wonder, her face became a familiar comfort. The setting itself magnified her impact. The studio at 46th and Market in Philadelphia was modest, but to the country it felt like a stage. Carmella was one of the reasons. She didn't need to command attention, she contributed to the collective rhythm that made Bandstand feel alive. Her small gestures, her way of blending into the music, were exactly what made her unforgettable. Looking back, it's clear that her first steps on Bandstand were more than a personal experience. They were part of the birth of a cultural phenomenon. And in those early broadcasts, Carmella became a thread in the fabric of national memory. Even now, when we revisit those moments, she feels less like a performer from the past and more like someone we once knew, someone we still wish we could see step forward when the music starts again. Every era of American Bandstand had its couples, the pairs whose chemistry seemed to leap from the screen, capturing the imagination of audiences far beyond Philadelphia. For many viewers, that image was defined by Carmella MonteCarlo and her frequent partner, Charlie Zamal. They were not professionals, not celebrities, but in their easy rhythm together they became something larger than themselves, a picture of what it meant to be young, hopeful, and caught up in the music of their time. What set them apart was not perfection, but connection. Their dances were never rehearsed routines, but spontaneous movements shaped by the records spinning in the studio. Charlie's steady guidance, Carmella's natural grace, the way their eyes sometimes met mid-step, it all suggested an innocence that resonated with teenagers at home. To the audience, they looked less like two kids performing and more like two friends, maybe even sweethearts, lost in a rhythm only they could hear. Magazines later echoed that perception, labeling them America's Sweethearts. It was a title that captured not just their presence on the floor, but the cultural role they played. For a nation tuning in 5 afternoons a week, their dances became shorthand for the optimism and romance of the late 1950s. They were the couple you wanted to watch, the pair you hoped the camera would find, because their joy felt genuine. Over the years, memories of Carmella and Charlie blurred into legend. Fans recalling the show decades later often named them as one of the pairs who defined the Bandstand generation. Their steps, preserved in fading photographs and fragile reels of film, came to symbolize something more than entertainment. They represented the sweetness of first love, the thrill of adolescence, and the possibility that two ordinary kids could become part of the nation's story. Yet there is a bittersweetness to remembering them now. While their image remains fixed in youthful glow, life inevitably carried them down separate paths. The magic of their partnership belonged to a moment in time, and like all moments, it passed. For Carmella especially, the shadow of her early death makes the memory ache even more. To think of her smiling beside Charlie is to be reminded not only of what was, but of what was lost. And still, when fans close their eyes and summon the images of Bandstand, the memory returns. Carmella and Charlie, moving as one, reminding America that sometimes the simplest steps are the ones that last forever. Carmella's story cannot be told without mentioning her sister, Joanne MonteCarlo. Together, the sisters formed a quiet but remarkable chapter in American bandstand history. Two young women from the same family, both stepping onto the national stage at a time when television was still shaping America's cultural heartbeat. For fans, the MonteCarlo sisters embodied something deeply relatable. They weren't distant stars. They were sisters, sharing music, laughter, and the nervous excitement of being part of something bigger than themselves. Joanne carved out her own place in bandstand's history. In 1958, she and her partner Frank Lobos won third place in a cha-cha contest, proving that the MonteCarlo name was more than just familiar faces in the crowd. It was a name tied to the competitions, the traditions, and the excitement that defined the program. While Carmella often captured attention as Charlie Zamal's graceful partner, Joanne provided another thread to the story: the determination and spirit of a sibling who shared the same stage, but with her own style and triumphs. It is easy to imagine the two of them side by side, arriving at the WFIL studio together, fixing each other's hair before the cameras turned on, whispering encouragement before stepping into the crowd of dancers. These small, unseen moments gave depth to the on-screen image. They weren't just dancers, they were sisters navigating adolescence together, with the unique twist that their teenage years were broadcast to millions. For viewers at the time, the sisters offered a sense of familiarity. Families watching at home saw their own children reflected in the MonteCarlo girls, and the idea that two siblings could share this unusual experience made the bandstand phenomenon feel even more grounded in real life. They represented the neighborhoods of Philadelphia, the tight-knit communities that gave the show its authenticity. But memory carries both light and shadow. Joanne lived on, her name appearing in reunions and remembrances, while Carmella's life was cut short. This divergence makes the story of the sisters even more poignant. When fans recall the MonteCarlo name, it brings with it both joy and grief. Joy for the dances and contests that brightened the airwaves, and grief for the sister whose dance ended far too soon. In the end, the MonteCarlo sisters symbolize more than just two dancers on a TV program. They symbolize family, shared dreams, and the fragile nature of time. And through Joanne's survival and Carmella's loss, we are reminded how one name can carry both celebration and sorrow in equal measure. To the public, she was Carmen. To her family, she was Carmella. That single difference in a name may seem small, but over time it became part of her story, part of the way she is remembered and sometimes misremembered. In the grainy broadcasts of American Bandstand, announcers and fans often used Carmen MonteCarlo, a name that flowed easily and seemed ready for television. For those who loved her personally, however, she was always Carmella, the girl behind the smile, the daughter, the sister, and later, the mother. This duality has puzzled fans for decades. People revisiting Bandstand Memories often wondered if Carmen and Carmella MonteCarlo were two different dancers. Others confused her with another regular, Carmen Jimenez. The truth is simpler, yet also more touching. There was only one MonteCarlo sweetheart, and she lived in both names. In some ways, the split reveals the two sides of her life, the public figure preserved in film and the private woman whose story unfolded beyond the cameras. The choice of which name to use today is meaningful. Saying Carmen recalls the shared memory of a nation, the teenager twirling across television screens in the late 1950s. Saying Carmella brings us closer to the truth, acknowledging the young woman who laughed with her sister backstage, who later raised two daughters of her own, who lived a life unseen by millions. Each name opens a different door, but together they form the whole of her identity. There is also a certain poetry in the confusion. Carmella's life was short, her story fragile, and even her name reflects that sense of impermanence. Like many bandstand regulars, she was swept into a current of fame she never sought, remembered through images and fragments rather than detailed accounts. The fact that her name could be altered so easily, remembered in one form by strangers and in another by family, underscores how delicate memory can be. And perhaps that is why her story resonates so deeply. We remember Carmella because she was real, because she was part of a family, because she left behind children who still carry her legacy. We remember Carmen because she was the sweetheart on screen, the girl who danced beside Charlie Zamal, the one who made a nation pause for a moment and smile. Together, Carmen and Carmella remind us that identity is never simple, and that memory, like life, is always layered. For many American Bandstand regulars, the show was a brief but defining chapter, an extraordinary interruption in otherwise ordinary lives. Once the lights dimmed and the cameras moved on, most returned to school, jobs, or family responsibilities. Carmella MonteCarlo was no exception. Unlike singers who pursued careers in entertainment, she slipped back into the flow of everyday life, her time on television becoming a cherished memory rather than a lifelong identity. Those who knew her recall that she never sought to extend her fame. She was content to step away, to let the excitement of Bandstand become something she carried quietly rather than something she used as a platform. In adulthood, she devoted herself to her family, raising two daughters who would later speak with pride about the woman they remembered not as a TV sweetheart, but as a mother. For them, the televised dances were only one part of her legacy. The larger part was found in her care, her warmth, and the guidance she offered in daily life. This turn away from the spotlight reveals something essential about Carmella's character. She had never been chasing applause. She'd been a teenager swept up in the tide of a cultural moment, and when that moment passed, she let it go. What remained was her authenticity, the same quality that had endeared her to viewers in the first place. Off camera, she became what she had always been, a woman defined not by celebrity, but by her relationships, her family, and her everyday acts of love. To fans, this quiet retreat only adds to the poignancy of her story. Unlike some regulars who reappeared at reunions or gave interviews decades later, Carmella remained largely absent from the public eye. As a result, her memory is pieced together from scattered images, a handful of anecdotes, and the enduring recollections of those who danced beside her. The silence of her later years creates a kind of void, an emptiness that invites both curiosity and sadness. And yet, there is beauty in that choice. Carmella's legacy reminds us that fame is fleeting, and that the truest measure of a life often lies in what happens away from the spotlight. She may have left television behind, but she built something far more lasting. A family, a circle of love, and the quiet dignity of a life lived honestly. It is precisely because her story ended so soon that these private years matter even more, painting a fuller picture of the girl who once danced her way into America's heart. October 29th, 1985. For the world at large, it was just another day. But for the family and friends of Carmella MonteCarlo, it was the day everything changed. At only 43 years old, Carmella's life came to an end, and with it, a chapter of bandstand history was closed. The news was quiet, without headlines or fanfare, but to those who remembered her, it felt like a light had gone out far too soon. There was no dramatic explanation offered to the public, no detailed obituary, no official statement to satisfy curiosity. Unlike celebrities whose deaths become events of spectacle, Carmella had lived her later years in privacy, and so her passing followed the same pattern. The cause was never widely revealed, and perhaps that is part of why the loss feels so haunting. What remains is not the how, but the stark reality of when, that her time was cut short at an age when life should still have been unfolding. For many, the dissonance was sharp. They remembered her forever young, twirling in black and white footage, a teenager in a full skirt and saddle shoes. To imagine her at 43 was already difficult, because in collective memory she had never grown older. And then to learn that she was gone entirely, was almost unbearable. It forced fans to confront the fragility not only of her life, but of their own youth. The era she represented, the innocence she embodied, all slipping away into the past. Those who loved her personally grieved a mother, a sister, a friend. Those who knew her only through television grieved something more symbolic, the reminder that time is unforgiving, that even the sweetest memories are shadowed by loss. In both cases, the pain was real. What lingers most is the unfinished quality of her story. Her death without explanation leaves her memory suspended, like a song that ends abruptly mid-note. And maybe that is why she continues to touch people decades later. Because she was not only the girl who danced joyfully on Bandstand, she was also the woman whose life, full of promise, ended in silence. And that silence, as much as her laughter, has become part of her legacy. Carmella MonteCarlo's story is one of beauty, brevity, and remembrance. She was once just a teenager who danced her way into America's afternoons, yet decades later, her image still carries weight. To fans, she remains frozen in time, smiling, twirling, radiant with a joy that seems eternal. To her family, she is remembered as a daughter, a sister, and a mother whose love reached far beyond the camera's gaze. Her early death in 1985, at just 43 years old, left an ache that words can scarcely capture. But the truth of her legacy lies not in the silence of her absence, but in the warmth of what she gave while she was here. Each memory of her is a reminder of the fragile, fleeting nature of life and the power of simple joy to echo across generations. We honor Carmella not just by recalling her dances, but by cherishing the era she represented. And if these stories move you, subscribe to our channel, so together we can keep alive the memories of those who left us too soon.